Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Lauren.
I am Ken.
And this is Paradise After Dark.
Dark.
Paradise After Dark is an independent podcast covering true crime,
Unsolved mysteries,
missing people,
urban legends, and every now and then a strange place.
If you'd like to support our show and get a bunch of extra Paradise After Dark content, sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/Palmahawk Media. That's PALMAHAWK Media.
And be sure to visit our website, paradiseafterdark.com.
On the website, you'll find links to all of our episodes, even the archived episodes, mailing list, merch store, links to our social medias, and of course, our Patreon.
And don't forget, if you want to get a shout out on the show, you can swing by the website and drop some coins in the tip jar, and we will holler your name out. So, Lauren, tonight, we're doing something a little bit different because we're looking at possibly taking a little bit of a break here towards the end of the year for some holiday stuff.
Yes, actually, we're going to be taking the month of December off from Paradise After Dark. It's been this year we decided the beginning of the year that we were going to go weekly instead of bi-weekly. So this year has been sort of a whirlwind of case after case after case after case, and we've gotten into the swing of it, but we need a break.
Yeah. It can tend to be overwhelming. Well, also, too, keep in mind that we have crossed the border. We're no longer just strictly in Florida. We're just where we normally, our stomping ground usually is. But this year we have traipsed beyond that Florida-Georgia line and kind of went all over the world here.
We did.
Had some cases in Germany. We did some in the
Bali.
UK. Yeah, so we've done quite a bit.
Yep.
And of course that's with us. And now Lauren, if you haven't heard already, with her shameless plugs here and there, she's got a completely independent podcast on her own called Massacre on Muriel Court.
Yes.
So I think we're going to give you guys a little special something. But first, I'd like to ask Lauren a few questions about this Massacre on Muriel Court. Trust me, you are going to love Massacre on Muriel Court. It's a really deep dive. And it's interesting because you really get to expand on one case and get everything, way more than we can put in just a couple episodes. So
yes. Before you ask me questions, can I just let our listeners know what the topic is of Massacre on Muriel Court?
Sure. That was question one. Check.
Massacre on Muriel Court, like Ken said, is a deep dive into the murder of Robert Helen and 12-year-old Joy Sims. They were murdered in Tallahassee, Florida on October 22nd, 1966. Now, this case is still unsolved to this day, and I think it's solvable. So I think it's worth my time to investigate and research every single aspect of this case. And that's what Massacre on Muriel Court is.
Well, Lauren, you also do you like those kind of the long form podcasts that really takes you kind of deep into it. So, but when was it that you really decided that this is the case that you wanted to do? I mean, when I should say, not what, when did you really want to get involved in looking into this case?
Well, you and I covered this case in a 3-episode podcast in 2019. And I want to say about a year and a half to 2 years ago is when I really started thinking about doing a long form. And then about a year ago is when I really started to put things together as far as putting together episodes and gathering research. And about 6 months ago is when I really doubled down and started creating this show. It's been about a year in the works, but now we've got 4 episodes as of right now, this recording, and I was looking at 7 to 8 episodes. Now it's looking like it's going to be more like 13 or 14 because I'm just finding more and more information.
Well, that's the other thing. That's another question I had for you. As you progress, and I think you just kind of hit on it. Were there like a certain, we find this too when we do the regular weekly episodes that you sort of get into a rabbit hole. So on this one, obviously the one rabbit hole led you to some other theories. So there's a lot more involved than what the average person can either find out on a podcast or by, just researching a few little things, a couple websites here and there, right?
Yes, there's so many moving parts to this case, and parts of it are so convoluted, it's very hard to wrap your head around it, which is why I'm taking special care in each episode to explain everything thoroughly. And I even have an episode of Who's Who so that I can explain who every character is in each episode so you know who I'm talking about.
Well, one thing, too, that I found, and obviously I have a little bit of an inside track, but I found interesting is you not only did your own research and you're putting together your episodes, you've actually reached out to several other people and gotten information, and one of which is very, very, very close to this case.
Yes.
Right? And I think that is going to help bring a lot of new information in. I mean, I don't want you to give it away because they need to go listen, and then obviously I think you interview an author, and then you've emailed people that didn't necessarily want to communicate with you via mic, but they've emailed you, things like that, right?
Right. Yes. I have a lot of insight, a lot of information, a lot of people I've spoken to. As far as I know, I don't think anyone has dove this deep into this case outside of like law enforcement.
Well, you'll find out later they didn't really do that either.
Yeah. I don't know of anyone. I don't know of any books written. There's a documentary, but there's a lot left out of the documentary. I mean, and I am exploring every single theory, as crazy as it sounds, and I'm talking to people. I have someone who has intimate knowledge of the case who's given me so much material to work with, inside information that's not publicly available. And
were you able to interview that person, or is this just basically information that was provided?
Yes, there will be 2 episodes where I interview this person.
Okay, perfect.
And I've actually exchanged emails with one of the main suspects in the case. It's a lot. There's a lot going on with Massacre on Muriel Court. It's been a roller coaster, and I'm not finished. It's, I'm still going with it.
Well, and that's one of the things too that I think you mentioned earlier, that you were started out was supposed to be this many episodes, and now but I mean, you can't even, at this point, you still cannot even tell us how many episodes this is going to be.
Right.
I mean, there may be more coming, because I know I heard you the other day say, well, it looks like I've got one more avenue I have to explore, and there's a lot of information there.
Well, everything that pops up, I'm going to explore. Every theory, even new theories that the other day I was speaking to someone very close to the case, and a new name popped up that I had never heard before. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. So now I need to go down that rabbit hole and, look at that theory. I'm going to lay it all out on the table.
Well, and that's one thing too, I can say that when we covered this case, like Lauren said back in 2019, she was pretty passionate about this case then. And normally at that point, we were just doing one episode every 2 weeks. It was a lot of research because obviously we were both working, and this was something we were trying out. And this case was literally consuming her at that point. So now you can imagine if she's taken this deep dive into it to where we were able to do 3 episodes then. It's just huge at this point.
Yes.
The other thing too, Lauren, is there's other cases involved. I mean, there's other cases that are similar that might be attached, so that you go down some of those roads too.
There's
I don't want you to give away
connections. Yes.
Yeah. So this is not, I mean, there's a lot of things obviously in as you learn when you listen to true crime podcasts, that a lot of times some cases are attached to other cases. It's like the Stephen King novels. If you read those, the connection in the characters is vast.
Right.
Well, you totally agree. I mean, there's some things that are close. So to finish up before we give them their special little gift, what are you looking to get out of this podcast? What result are you looking for? What would make you feel good with this podcast?
My main goal is to not let this case die. The fact that it's from 1966, a lot of people that were involved at the time are now passed away. And if this case is not solved in the next 10 years, I think it'll never be solved. But I do know right now, this case is completely solvable. And I just don't want it to die. And I want to keep it in the forefront of people's minds. And somebody may hear this and have information, or somebody's grandchild may hear this and say, Grandma, do you remember in 1966 when this happened? And, then Grandma might say, oh, yeah, and I have information. Let's call the Leon County Sheriff's Office. And that's my goal.
Good.
That's my goal. It's just to keep it alive.
I think that's kind of everyone that does a podcast or listens to true crime. That's kind of what you're looking for. So that's sort of admirable. And appreciate you taking the time to talk to me before we lead them on this path of the very first episode of
Massacre on Muriel Court. And just so you know, this podcast is available on all podcast platforms. And it's also on our Patreon. If you are a patron or are interested in joining our Patreon, you get ad-free early episodes for Massacre on Muriel Court, and there is some exclusive content from the show that I have put on Patreon. So, without further ado, I'm going to give you episode 1. Hopefully it sucks you in, and please go ahead, listen to that through the month of December, and Ken and I will be back with Paradise After Dark in 2023.
Yeah, everyone, and thank you very much for listening
to Paradise After Dark.
Dark, 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 dark.
Something evil lurks in Tallahassee, Florida. You can't see it, but you can feel it. Something wrong and ugly. Long before the Mike Williams murder, which we covered extensively on Paradise After Dark, and before Ted Bundy made his mark on the city, running parallel to the horrors of the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys was the murder of the Sims family. On Saturday, October 22nd, 1966, 3 of the 5 members of the Sims family were massacred in their home at 641 Muriel Court. Today is Saturday, October 22nd, 2022, and this is Massacre on Muriel Court.
It's mostly quiet on Muriel Court, but that wasn't the case in 1966 when Robert Sims, his wife Helen, and young daughter Joy found gagged, stabbed, and shot to death.
Safer politically to leave it alone. Moronic is the word that comes to mind.
He's accusing 2 top officials of a cover-up.
Standing back there under the banana tree.
Surveillance video of a 1966 FSU football game may be the key to cracking the code in this case gone cold.
You do that.
And while state officials aren't releasing details regarding suspects or persons of interest, it did stress their commitment to finding the Sims killers.
Oh, I think you did it. All of a sudden you became absolutely down, totally obsessed with that.
It's a case that we would certainly like to see solved, and investigators are actively working on the case.
It was a Saturday. The front page of the Tallahassee Democrat called for considerable cloudiness and mild weather, with a considerable chance of rain. The high would be around 76 and the low near 62. Other front page news included the names and photos of the homecoming court at Leon High School, an article about the helicopters the U.S. was using over in Vietnam getting night vision lenses. LBJ's motorcade was stopped in Sydney, Australia because anti-war protesters laid in the street, not allowing him to pass. This would be the last front page of this newspaper that didn't feature the Sims family for a while. Let's set the scene here. Tallahassee is the capital city of Florida. It is the county seat and only incorporated municipality in Leon County. In 2020, the population was 196,169 people, making it the 8th largest city in the state of Florida and the 126th largest city in the United States. Tallahassee is the largest city in the Florida Big Bend and Florida Panhandle region, and the main center for trade and agriculture in the Florida Big Bend and the Southwest Georgia regions. Back in 1966, the population was around 48,000 people. It was considered a small town where everyone knew everyone, with virtually the entire population living within 1 mile of the capital. The town revolved around government and the colleges. The cliché saying no one locked their doors was a real thing in this town back then. While many people know about the brutal killings at an FSU sorority house by Ted Bundy in 1978, longtime residents point to the Sims murders as the moment when Tallahassee lost its innocence. Former Tallahassee Police Chief Frank Studemeyer called it the worst crime I have seen in my 28 years in law enforcement. And on a personal note, there's something about Tallahassee, and I'm not sure if it's the old buildings, the hills and winding roads that are usually pretty rare in Florida, or maybe the history of the city, but Tallahassee honestly gives me the creeps. We stayed there twice, just overnight each time, and I could never shake that creepy feeling. It's almost like there's a bad energy in the air up there. Anyway, October 22nd, 1966 turned out to be a beautiful day in Tallahassee. That evening, nearly everyone in town was either at or watching as Florida State beat Mississippi 10-0. FSU was, and still kinda is, the heart of Tallahassee. The North Florida Fair was also in town. Events like this quite literally left the streets empty, since big entertainment like this was infrequent in the area. But for the Sims family, this Saturday evening, Dr. Robert Wilson Sims, his wife Helen, and their youngest daughter, Joy Lynn, were home in their modest brick ranch house at 641 Muriel Court, most likely watching the FSU game on TV. Their 2 older daughters, Jenny and Judy, were babysitting nearby for parents who were attending the football game. At approximately 11:15 p.m., the Sims' oldest daughter, Jenny, arrived home. The first thing Jenny noticed was that the kitchen door, which led out into the carport, was open, and this was very odd. This was the door that the family used most to enter and exit the home, and they were all very good about keeping it closed. When she entered the house, she could hear the TV playing, but she couldn't find the rest of her family members. She meandered through the house, looking for them when she came upon the master bedroom, her parents' room, and what she saw has undoubtedly haunted her to this day. There in that room she found her father, mother, and little sister, all bound and gagged with blood everywhere. Dr. Robert Wilson Sims, dressed in slacks, a sports shirt, and socks and shoes, was lying atop a flowered bedspread on the couple's king-size bed. Neckties were used to tie his hands behind his back and his feet together. His mouth was gagged with a scarf, and a piece of cloth covered his eyes. He had been shot once, point blank in the head. Helen Sims, barefoot, in pink slacks with a blouse, was found on the bedroom floor. She was tied up with pantyhose and also gagged with a scarf. She was shot 3 times, twice in the head at point-blank range, and once in the leg. 12-year-old Joy Sims was found on the bedroom floor next to her mother. She was also tied up with a necktie and pantyhose stuck in her mouth to gag her. She had been shot once in the head and stabbed 7 times in the torso with a large hunting or butcher knife, or some have theorized it was a bayonet. Please remember this detail. Joy had been punched in the face many times. Neither of the other victims had been hit. There was an abrasion on her face consistent with being punched by someone wearing a ring. The stab wounds and punch to the face were both consistent with a left-handed person. The stab wounds were actually said to be in a cross-type pattern. Remember this detail as well. There were signs of possible sexual assault against Joy because her underwear was pulled down and her nightgown was pulled up. There were bloody handprints on the inside of her thighs, small handprints consistent with maybe a woman's. Side note, and there's something I would really like you guys to remember. At the time of this investigation, Sheriff William Joyce was adamant that there had been no sexual element to this crime. But Ed Yarborough, director of the Florida Sheriff's Bureau, now the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or FDLE, disagreed, telling the Palm Beach Post the crime was, quote, the works of a sexually deranged person, a sex maniac. Leon County investigators maintained the murders lacked a sexual element for decades, It wasn't until 2006 that it was revealed that Joyland's panties had been pulled down and there was an unspecified indication of molestation. There was no 911 back in 1966, so Jenny, after discovering her family, rushed to the kitchen and found the phone book. When she entered the kitchen, she saw that the front door was open. She could have sworn that it wasn't open when she first entered the house. She found the phone number she needed and made an urgent call to the Beavis Funeral Home for an ambulance. Yes, back in 1966 in Tallahassee, the funeral homes had the ambulances. It's hard to imagine, right? She had just found her family brutally murdered, and she had to go find a phone book, flip through until she found the phone number for a funeral home. Russell Beavis, owner of Beavis Funeral Homes, was just returning from the football game when the phone rang. Russell's 16-year-old son Rocky had just come in the back door and picked up the phone at the same time as his father. "Something terrible has happened. Please come," Jenny Sims pleaded to the ambulance service. Russell and Rocky Beavis raced to the scene. Upon arriving and witnessing the carnage, the elder Beavis sent his son to fetch something to unbind the parents in an attempt to save their lives. Russell Beavis called the police. Among some of the interesting evidence found at the crime scene, the knots used to bound the Sims were a specialized kind of granny knot, and all the bindings used to tie up the family had come from inside the home belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Sims. It had been said that the crime scene appeared so fresh that the Beavises feared the killer or killers may still be in the house or lurking around the home. Dr. Sims died shortly after the Beavises' arrival, but Mrs. Sims was transported to the hospital where she was kept under guard. Little Joy Sims was beyond saving by the time they got there. And Mrs. Sims died 9 days later, on Halloween, never regaining consciousness. The Sims family was fairly new to Tallahassee, moving from Meridian, Mississippi about 10 years before the murder. They are highly respected people. There are just not any finer folks in town, Leon County Deputy William P. Smith told the Chicago Tribune on October 25, 1966. Dr. Robert Sims was born August 24, 1942 in Meridian, Mississippi. He was considered Florida's nationally known educational computer expert. Some say he would have been the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. He got his Ph.D. from Florida State in 1961. He was the director of data processing for the Florida Department of Education. He was well known and respected in Tallahassee. He was also a veteran, a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army during World War II. Mr. Sims was 42 years old when he was murdered. Helen Sims, maiden name Solee, was born February 23, 1932 in Meridian, Mississippi. Helen's father, Reverend Solee, was the former pastor at Hebron Baptist Church in Meridian. She was a beauty queen when she was younger and had appeared in newspapers and magazines. Helen was a secretary at the First Baptist Church in Tallahassee, but she had resigned from that position just a few days before her murder. She was also described as quite the pianist. People would come to the church on their lunch break just to listen to her play. She was 34 years old when she was murdered. The Sims had 3 daughters, Jenny, 16, Judy, 15, and Joy, who was 12. Joy, the youngest, attended Raw Middle School. She was described by her classmates and friends as a very sweet girl and very smart. Jenny and Judy attended Leon High School. Both were in the National Honor Society. The entire family was described as just really nice people. Middle class, they were not involved in anything that would make them high risk for this type of assassination. It really made no sense. Who would brutally kill this nice family? Well, let's talk about the investigation. Investigators suspected this was an organized crime from the beginning due to the bindings, gags, and blindfolds. Someone had put thought into this crime before it was executed. But the case was difficult to solve from the start, starting with the disaster at the crime scene. The first lawman on the scene was Captain Billy Bennett. He was the watch commander that night. He then called Detective Cooper Donnelly to the scene. Larry Campbell, an investigator whose 50-year career in Florida law enforcement would culminate in several terms as Leon County Sheriff. At the time of the Sims murder, he was just 24 years old and the lead detective on this case. It was actually, coincidentally, Larry Campbell's 24th birthday. The call went out initially as a traffic accident with 2 fatalities. When Campbell got the call, he actually tried to pass it off because he was going to his own birthday party, but he couldn't get out of it. And on the way to the scene, which he thought was a car crash, he's told over the radio that it's actually a Signal 5, which meant it was a murder. It was par for the course in the 1960s. Investigators failed to secure the crime scene. Beavis says between on and off-duty authorities, curious neighbors, and reporters, almost 1,000 people walked through that house. Now, 1,000 could be an exaggeration, but there was definitely a lot of people traipsing through that home that shouldn't have been there. They went in and made coffee. It was probably textbook what you shouldn't do, Rocky Beavis told WCTV Tallahassee on April 28, 2015. They smoked inside the home and put their cigarette butts out in the family's ashtray. The sheriff's palm print was found on the trunk lid of the Sims car where he had reached out to steady himself. No murder weapon was ever found, but detectives believe the murderer used a .38 caliber handgun. There was no evidence of forced entry at the Sims residence, and nothing of value was missing. Small sums of money were visible on the dresser, and an expensive coin collection lay intact in a bedroom drawer. There were also no signs of any struggle throughout the house, aside from the master bedroom. There was a cup of coffee still sitting on the table. Everything looked orderly inside the home. Perhaps one of the strangest things about this crime scene was the Sims' marriage certificate was missing from where it hung on the wall. According to Jeremy Mutz, former state attorney who worked on the case, Mr. and Mrs. Sims were seen shopping at a local grocery store at 7:30 p.m. the night of the murders. In the days leading up to the murders, Mr. Sims cut short a business trip to return home, which was unusual. We know he returned home early one afternoon, shortly before the murders, which was something he never did. Now, he did this because one of his girls had telephoned him, scared about someone in the neighborhood. He had come home to reassure her. In the months leading up to the murders, Mr. Sims caught an intruder in the home. Mr. Sims was alone in the house and sensed someone was inside. He thought it was his wife. But when he got up to look, a male figure ran from him. Mrs. Sims replaced all her underwear in the weeks before the murders. Is it possible that a prowler had went through her underwear and she discarded them? Mrs. Sims abruptly quit her job as secretary at the First Baptist Church a couple days before the murders. That afternoon, we know that Mr. and Mrs. Sims were speaking in hushed tones, having a serious discussion that they didn't want their daughters to overhear. The murders had occurred at a particularly inopportune juncture. The FSU football game and the North Florida Fair had summoned hundreds of strangers into the community in the hours before the crime. The neighbors were grilled about where they were and what they were doing that evening. The Sims social circle was interviewed. Nearby woodlands searched, and a pond behind the home was drained. Nothing of evidentiary value was discovered. Detectives tracked down patrons who borrowed in cold blood from the Tallahassee library, theorizing that the crime may have been inspired by Truman Capote's novel. Everyone was identified and checked out, including 3 men from Wyoming who had been to see the Sims, the piano tuner, the Fuller brush man, and the maid, Leon County Sheriff William Joyce told the Anniston Star. Part of the problem here was that no one from the Tallahassee Police Department to the Leon County Sheriff's Office knew how to handle a crime like this. And it wasn't their fault, really. The area had never seen a crime like this. But as I've mentioned before, this was a small town at the time, and the neighbors did hear and see things that night. More on that after the break. According to Jeremy Mutz, who dug deep into this case, you'll be hearing that name a lot during this podcast. Behind the Sims home, there was a teenage girl who was babysitting, most likely for parents who were attending the FSU game or the North Florida Fair. At approximately 10:45 p.m., she heard the Sims' cats screaming. Have you ever heard cats scream? It's a pretty distinct sound. She then heard 5 gunshots and a scream, a human scream. But before that, at approximately 10 p.m., a neighbor heard a shrill scream. This is theorized to be the time the killer or killers entered the Sims' home. Herman Strike, who also lived behind the Sims' home, was at his kitchen window, which faced the Sims' home, and he heard 5 gunshots at 10:45 p.m. This man also noticed that the lights were very bright inside the Sims' home, which was odd. A young boy coming home from the football game at about 11:15 was driving down Gibbs Drive, the main artery throughout the neighborhood, and saw a young man walking from Muriel Court towards Von Sile Avenue. Please try to remember these street names. The man the boy saw was tall and slender, about 21, wore glasses, and very much matched the description of someone who would later become a main suspect in the case. Everyone in the neighborhood heard the ambulance coming through. The ambulance with the old siren came up Gibbs Drive and turned onto Muriel Court. They arrived at the home at 11:23 p.m. Another neighbor who lived on Gibbs saw, right as the ambulance was arriving, a young man who she recognized as the young man who lived on the corner of Gibbs and Von Sile Avenue. This young man was tall and slender, about 21, and wore glasses. His name was Vernon Fox, Jr. He was out in the street waving his arms and appeared to be gesturing to someone. Other neighbors claimed to have heard someone running through the woods between Muriel Court and Von Sile Avenue. There was a white car parked down by Raw Junior High, less than a mile from Muriel Court. This vehicle matched the description of another person who later became a main suspect in the case. One neighbor who lived near the junior high school claimed she saw the car take off fast towards Gibbs Drive, the same road the young man was spotted on. It was theorized right off the bat that there was more than one assailant. Mr. Sims was a large man, not easy to overpower, and the specialized granny knots used to tie up the family, it appears as if they didn't tie each other up. It is believed that Helen was shot first in the leg, maybe a warning shot so the family knew that these people meant business. It's more likely one killer held the gun on either Helen or Joy to get Robert to lay down and comply, tied him up and possibly shot him right away. Helen was tied up next, then Joy was tied up, beaten, possibly sexually assaulted, stabbed, and shot. Let us pray that her parents were both shot first so they didn't have to witness what was happening to their daughter. We woke up one morning and all of a sudden we were in an evil world. Former Leon County Sheriff Mike Wood describing the effects of the Sims murder on the community to WCTV Tallahassee on April 28, 2015. A sleepy town awoken by the murders of 3 innocent people while their killer or killers were still on the loose. The community withdrew from the streets. The hardware stores where you can buy guns and ammunition sold out almost the very next day. Women signed up for self-defense classes. They bought water guns and filled them with ammonia. Judo and martial arts classes became increasingly popular. City officials set up a prowler squad of officers with dogs to patrol the streets at night. City officials took the unprecedented step of canceling trick-or-treating that year. A neighborhood mother recalled how traumatized her daughter was after Joy was killed, insisting on checks in every room throughout the day. The houses on the street remained impossible to sell for years after the murder. I think what scared people the most was the lack of motive and the innocence of the victims. If there was a motive for this murder, a Sims neighbor told the Tallahassee Democrat on October 25, 1966, it would be different. At least we wouldn't have to worry much. But if this is a maniac, we have a lot to worry about. Another neighbor told the newspaper, people are pretty uneasy nowadays. They are liable to shoot at anything that walks into their yard at night. This is no place for a prowler and surely no place for a peeping Tom. See, in the weeks leading up to the murders, there had been reports of a peeping Tom in the neighborhood, which we will discuss in a later episode. As time passed and no arrests were made, people pressured Governor Hayden Burns to take the matter up to the Capitol. A $5,000 cash reward was offered for tips leading to an arrest. After just 1 month passed, an estimated 3,500 people had been interviewed, leads pursued in at least 10 different states, but the Sims murder remained a mystery.